year, a series on the theme Publicness. The next lecture in this series will be by Iman Ansari in 2 weeks on February 26th, followed by one last lecture by Emily Turner on March 18th. Today, however, we're lucky to be joined by not one, but both partners of the award-winning cross-disciplinary design practice, Opal. This young practice, in business for a little more than a decade, has used their New York-based office to explore the overlaps and oppositions between landscape architecture and architectural design. Interestingly, in descriptions of their work, the firm also lists optics as a third discipline and a common denominator between their two fields. This cross-fertilization evidences itself as a disciplinary richness in all of their projects, whether urban edifice, streetscape, garden, or folly in between. Today, I'm sure we'll see some such examples, but first I'll introduce our speakers. Jennifer Birkeland and Jonathan Schelse. Birkeland is a landscape architect, urbanist, partner of Opal, and assistant professor at Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Birkeland's research ranges from urban agriculture to hydroecology, to energy production to pedagogy, having published and exhibited widely. Beyond Opal, Birkeland has deployed her expertise to win competitions for the Washington Monument Grounds in DC, to the Presidio Parklands in San Francisco, as well as in practice with many of the leading landscape architecture firms in the world, West Nine, Olin, and Ken Smith, to name a few. Schelse is an architect, urbanist, and partner of Opal, and associate professor at Pratt Institute. Schelse's research, and I quote, explores the geometric legacy of optical mechanics, the contemporary robotic production of component-based construction, and the reorganization of the city around visible micro infrastructural elements. End quote. His work has been published and exhibited widely, and Schelse co-edited 2 important volumes. Oh, I meant to have one in my hand. The Function of Style in 2014 with Farshid Mousavi and others, and Pedagogical Experiments in Architecture for a Changing Climate, which was just released 2 weeks ago with editors Louis Callejas and others. The two met each other and me during a few fast and furious years at Harvard about 15 years ago. They went on to receive the American Academy in Rome Prize, Mark Hampton Award, as well as grants from the Architecture League of New York and many other prestigious organizations, including the Charles Moore Foundation here in Texas. Without further delay, please join me in giving a warm Texas Tech welcome to Jennifer Birkeland and Jonathan Schelse.
Thank you, David. Should we turn this on?
Are we on?
No, we're not on.
Or, okay.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm Jonathan.
I'm Jennifer.
And thank you guys all for having us here. This is a really absolute privilege. It's also just wonderful flying in and seeing you under this beautiful blanket of snow in the past 12 hours. It was a gorgeous experience.
Familiar, and sorry we brought it with us.
It might be hard. We're not sure, but thank you for having us. Interestingly, because we were thinking about the talk and the name of it, and it actually reminded us that, yes, David mentioned the notion of operations as OP as our name. The notion of optics is certainly in here in terms of like the op art movement. But actually, one of the first reasons we kind of named our office Opal was office public. We were talking about it in relationship to what you guys are thinking about in terms of publicness as one of the interfaces between landscape and architecture that we could talk a lot about in our careers.
I think one of the important things about the practice ultimately, and between Jonathan and I working together, is, we're really kind of projecting our own disciplines into each other through the work. So my training in landscape and his training in architecture and urbanism really, I think, fuels a lot of discussions, arguments, but also I think we really, bring our unique perspectives to the projects and help inform it to hopefully create something new.
So it means that we talk a lot about the different types of collaborations and where we're projecting through each other and like transmitting ideas across boundaries in a transdisciplinary way versus we're working together on a problem together in an interdisciplinary way. So we're going to be talking about two different versions of that in chapters tonight. And we're going to start with this idea of kind of projecting through and across and perhaps subverting each other's disciplines or the boundary in between as a starting point.
So traditionally, in architecture, it's normally seen as an object, right? You guys are given a site and a program, and you're sort of building this this envelope essentially. And landscape traditionally has this sort of conversation about controlling image, so the picturesque, and really, looking at vista and a way to kind of understand, but also capture and kind of control nature. So that in itself is something that we try to subvert and sort of work against. So how do you sort of convert the idea into architecture more as image, and how does landscape then become object, which has informed a lot of projects through different lenses. Right?
So throughout that, we work with the idea of representational logics. Jen mentioned the picturesque or architectural constructive drawing as a method of subversion, the notion of assembly through parts and figural components that are happening in both of our disciplines. And also just really, we think we often use types or known typologies or the idea of place as a kind of mechanism for subversion. So we're going to go through a couple of early projects that were kind of dealing with these notions. Thinking about drawing, and one of the first projects we got into was this question of anamorphosis as a mechanism to really root one in place, but also out of place at the same time. Anamorphosis, as we saw some in the drawings upstairs, just kind of the tape drawings, becomes a method of flattening the figure into the ground in very many ways. And just as we see this idea of the house form stuck in the landscape, this becomes something we're very much interested in.
And the other thing within that, I think, in taking the silhouette of the house, right, thinking about the domestic and sort of subverting it into nature, we're really kind of creating, again, this sort of reversal of the subject and the object into something that's incredibly recognizable, and yet kind of, inscribing it into the landscape in a different and sort of unusual way.
I think for us, one of the questions that became here was this kind of discipline of history of citing oneself in a specific vantage point that obviously goes back to points in Rome, but also as a way to reconstruct that which is not there. So transform geometry, which was a project that was very big part of our tutelage, into something that was more flat and image-based. So here in these kind of notions of the house, we see kind of the absence of the bottom of the form of the house that is then reproduced in its landscape form. We're using another image-based concept of CMYK dot separation to subtract out the 4 different colors of the house to 4 different specific vantage points as a way to reprojectively connect them back together. So this to us, we found is a really interesting way to make a form of abstraction and a way that kind of inserts the object into the ground.
And then wait, why don't you talk about that?
And then, so the model became a testing point for us in this. We were fortunate to exhibit this in a few different fashions, and specifically in the gallery, kind of locating the vantage point, not necessarily to how it might be seen in a competition like field, but actually to the eye level of someone who is inside of a gallery for a point of testing that idea.
Okay. The next project we're going to talk about was actually something that we did here in Austin. It was part of a competition that we won with the university. It was at the Circle Acres Nature Preserve. It was a former landfill site turned ecological restorative area. And we became interested in the idea and the sort of history of camouflage, particularly obviously as it's sort of being a screening and a way to hide oneself. But we were kind of looking at how then traditional camouflage pattern could then become poché.
And maybe also at the same time, we were excited to be, if we were working on a camouflage project, how could it fall into its landscape for camouflage, but also be shouting at the top of its lungs at the same time. So that difference between the interiority and the exteriority became a question of a disciplinary question of separation from inside to outside. It can be seen in some of these Fabergé egg kind of studies here, but also, and we came into a question on how can we bring that history of even, for example, the Venturi decorated shed project deeply into the project as a reference point. So you start seeing how the geodesic construction and that technical problem becomes a way of assembling and inserting reference deep into the project of things that we're thinking about.
So those were all earlier images, and then we won and realized, oh, we have to figure this out. So there became a series of at-home studies, which took up a majority of our apartment, and it was covered in raffia for a good 3 months before we left for Texas. But there was a lot of testing and obviously a lot of making that happened prior to our arrival in Austin. And these are some of the final images. This was part of the East Austin Music Festival. This was a stop that was along that circuit, I believe, that happens every year. Okay.
And this is a project that we were, to bring this up to a larger scale, was a project we were invited to design for a city in Zhengzhou, China. So it was a master plan, actually, so getting really far up into a bigger scale. And it was a question on how do we engage a landscape of known types. There was a program that was given to us where the types were very regimented in terms of the kind of organization and the macro form of the building. So for us, it became a question of, is there a possibility where the tectonics and the kind of the way that we were thinking about ornament could actually become a way to subvert those and kind of create a unification across the scheme.
And this is an area, this is a brand new city. It was off of one of the largest areas where iPhones are made. So the program itself was a commercial center as well as residential with a new lake and a subway station. So we were really sort of tasked with creating an inviting urban realm, as this was part of a larger sort of commute system. But this was also meant to have one of the larger markets in the area. So they were anticipating this would have a lot of traffic to it as a sort of cultural and civic hub. But so there were a lot of the conversations that we were having in terms of the design was how do we incorporate the landscape and the architecture graphically?
And in many ways, this kind of obviously ties directly back to, for example, Frank Stella, who's a reference kind of inserted into this project, and the notion, the kind of movement of the folded canvas, where that process became a mechanism quite literally here of creating aperture, creating folded kind of entry, and kind of bringing involuting the exterior of the form and forms, for example, in this mall into the internal boulevard. So that question of how could even the image itself be something that breaks internally into the object again becomes something that we were thinking about in these kind of early projects. So I think probably what's circulated and what we're predominantly going to be talking about today is this notion of interdisciplinary infrastructure, where we kind of work together on a more specific project, perhaps part of the public and common round. And I think one thing that has become a recurring discussion in here is we're interested in a project of daylighting unseen systems of the city, or systems that have historically been buried or pushed outwards to the hinterlands, and questioning that relationship between the seen and unseen. In our view, this sponsors a type of accountability, or an accountability of aesthetics that we can start to think about, where the role of architecture and landscape design is to reintegrate the lost unseen into the daily lives of our existence.
Mm-hmm. So when we were kind of examining projects that we were going to bring to you guys today, the way that we started to unpack it was in thinking through typologically what are some projects that obviously incorporate both architecture and landscape. So the first that we're going to go through is how does the roof, obviously work in the components of the building, but also how can it become performative? How could it become a green roof? How could it, collect water, et cetera? The next type is the courtyard. So landscape within a building, obviously a very sort of historic example. But again, how do we sort of question that as a mode moving forward? The third being the shed. So we're going to show you some really interesting sort of precedents that have inspired us. But again, looking at the sort of mega building, which I know is something that is a common typology in the hinterlands, and looking at it through a form of landscape. Then the next is the exedra, which is a Roman technique, which is looking into pushing into the building and really kind of creating an externalization of the foyer into the landscape. So really kind of bridging this conversation of public and private. And then the last being facade, which ultimately could go into conversation about green roofs or vegetal walls, and really kind of questioning those as a typology moving forward, because the technology with them is still very new.
So we're going to start by taking it back to Brooklyn, and really to a site that has gained a lot of national attention as a space of deindustrialization, which is the Gowanus Canal. More recently, this has been a site of heavy gentrification and new development, but it has become one of the Superfund sites that has notorious in New York. It has become a part of where much of New York's industry was polluting inside of the borough of Brooklyn, and became a really big fascination point for us about how does it drain and how does that drainage deal with its kind of surrounding systems, particularly in a space that is constantly dredged and reworked as part of our daily commutes. And I think this gets into the question for us as we started to investigate this about how do our cities drain? How do they kind of deal with water? And historically, particularly one of the problems in New York is that the way that water was designed to go into the system combines both the overflow and the water of the roofs of the groundscape, and it combines with our sewage system, which means that in port city or an edge-based city, when the water when rising tides flood, that means that you're getting sewage and other really disgusting things on the street, which has become more and more a subject as this area has become occupied for more and more people to live in. So this question of combined versus non-combined sewage overflow became something we started to study.
This is a conversation that happens in a lot of cities in terms of growing populations and obviously investments in infrastructure. So one of the things that we've started with was this idea of the sewer shed, which is similar to a watershed that you may not necessarily know very much about, but it's sort of looking at a specific region that then ties back topographically to a particular point area. And so in sewer sheds, they're normally broken up by districts, which you can see on the left, that are then taken to a specific water treatment plant, that then the water will be treated and then either sent out to sea or recycled back, depending on the level of clarity and filtration. So we were really sort of interested in understanding each of these urbanistically. So we studied their porosity, their imperviousness, their materiality, looking at obviously what are the building types, how are they being used, and then we needed to understand more regionally, what is the amount of water that we're sort of talking about here, generally throughout the year, and what are the different sort of relationships that it's making back to buildings. So looking at that in terms of a map, we created this more detailed sort of analysis of, again, understanding the roadway systems, and how the water is flowing, just as a way to be able to dive into the analysis much more deeply.
And while that was thinking a lot about the groundscape, we were also thinking about how the buildings contributed to this as a kind of another part of that urban topology. And so we started to examine these from the different, across their different formal types and how they would divert water into the ground, and started to speculate on what are other forms that could be dealing with that in other ways, either internally through, for example, the impluviate roof, which we'll talk about actually in another project as well, versus the idea of a folding that could actually deal with a roof courtyard system that could become either privatized, as shown in these diagrams, or part of a much larger public sequence. So as a way to start thinking about this as a design impetus, we took a transect of the Gowanus Canal, started to study them in terms of their zoning typologies, thinking about different ways that they could be overlaid with program. Here's an example of that in its generic form. And thinking about that, how that could become a larger roof kind of superficial layer that actually starts to be reprogrammed through potentially a bridge system or a series of other overlay programs that would be about absorbing water and providing new development, new possibility for growth, but also in a way that would be ameliorating an existing problem. So we see here this kind of activation of a second level of city in a very speculative fashion. And this was all done as a part of a grant that we won with New York State Council of the Arts as a way to study this both in terms of its mapping and a projected form. It also tied into another competition which we were dealing with simultaneously about water treatment plants.
Water treatment plant, and also just sort of looking at the Gowanus Canal specifically, how do we turn it into more of an educational center for the neighborhood as it is sort of changing and continues to change with zoning developments. So this was sort of just looking at larger Brooklyn, the existing water treatment plants that are around the area. And so we were kind of using this to make an argument that why then couldn't Gowanus have its own water treatment plant? So the competition asked for what would happen and where this sort of education station would exist. So our proposal, being a bit fanciful, was that we would drain a portion of the canal and put a water treatment plant inside of the canal, and actually bring back the historic ghost stream of where the stream was before all of the development happened. And then through that, we said that we would have a large crane that would pick up boats and so that the canal could still be in use, and it would be the spectacle for the neighborhood. And everybody would love it, right? Because everybody wants a giant crane gantry in their backyard.
But I think one of the provocations here was the notion of that this is infrastructure that we deal with, but we don't often think about. And while Brooklyn is continuing to offset this farther away from its centralized stream, could there be an opportunity where infrastructure is thought about culturally? It could become part of the cultural imagination. It could be reprogrammed with cultural spaces such as, for example, theaters, while also dealing with these nexus. So obviously a provocation, but I think we're trying to think about infrastructure in a different way.
Yes.
Maybe in a way that we started to see that was more deeply ingrained in other historical spaces.
Right. So this is a project that we did as part of the our fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. This is with the annual exhibit of all of the fellows, and we called it Flat Farms. Because initially, when we went to Rome, it was a continuation of the Gowanus work, where we were interested in studying the Roman home, the Duomus, which essentially was a completely closed, circulated water system that they would gather water from in the center of their homes, and it would go into a cistern beneath the house, and that is how they would obviously use water within the homes. We were really interested again in this sort of relationship to the landscape, the roofscape, and the home. Traditionally, also as well, I'm sure you're familiar with the Roman frescoes, right? They were, especially in places like Pompeii and in Rome, Romans were incredibly fascinated with sort of bringing nature into their incredibly dense urban environments. So they would have the interiors of their home painted with these very rich landscapes, showcasing fruits and flowers, vegetables and nature as a way, obviously, to sort of create that connection with nature that had been lost because of the urbanization of the cities.
And simultaneously, particularly this happening during the second style, there became a real severe interest in the notion of illusion and how could the study of drawing create a space where we could start to project faux 3D, which was something that was being studied obviously in still lives, but also even in the way that certain spaces, so certain garden spaces were perceived as hidden within the walls. Actually, there's a minor argument that this was actually a way to subvert that which was mandatorily public for senatorial kind of reasons, the idea of hiding kind of forsaken garden spaces inside of it. So there's a really this interest on inserting the garden back into the home, but doing so in illusionistic practice.
This was you.
You can even see that as tracery in the way that tiles are made to create a certain three-dimensionality in the kind of in the simple black and white studies. So this became a fodder for our own studies on how to kind of create an installation that would kind of activate this kind of this consciousness. Starting to think again, bringing back in our initial studies, bring back ways to utilize the tiling for its high graphic nature to kind of create connectivity.
And the Academy, which you'll see some photos of in a minute, actually is a courtyard building. So there is a cortile with an arcade that exists in the center of it. And so in our research, we started to study, I had been familiar with the act of espalier, which is a very specific type of pruning, which actually dates back to the Egyptians, where you would essentially prune a species of plant that you're looking to harvest from in a very specific geometric pattern so that you're not having to go up inside of the tree to gather the fruit, but it's actually sort of splayed against the geometry of a building. So this was something that, graphically we were sort of very interested in, and also just sort of as a practice for agricultural production, how could we start to visualize that more? So we proposed the pillars in the Academy be wrapped. We first wanted to just have little wires, and the building grounds person came back and said, you cannot drill into these 200-year-old columns, you ridiculous designers, for the love of God, figure something else out. So when we got to Italy, we immediately went to the garden store and found massive rolls of screening fence that is used in everyday gardens all over the world. And so they allowed us to wrap the columns rather than drill tiny little holes into them, because we wanted to create the illusion of four corners of the historic sort of espalier projections into the cortile. This practice, what used to happen inside of the courtyard before the aqueduct was actually invented, so the publification of water and the investment of infrastructure moved then the courtyard from a private landscape into one of pleasure. Or production, excuse me, yes.
So when we started to play with ways of making this, we started to get into the idea again of that graphic kind of assemblage or quilting of black and white. And we also needed a method of making something that we could transport and reconfigure on the other side of the ocean. So the practice became a method of making these individual kind of quilted fabrics of plastic, as you can see here, that we would then reassemble based on our kind of surveyed, kind of offsite surveyed measurements of the McKinney White courtyard. So this became, here we are assembling one of these on from one vantage point. And so you can start to see that each of these station points, as it were, which again relates to other kind of more Baroque and late Rococo architects from Rome, such as Andrea Pozzo, where you're starting to see this notion of occupying a specific moment to view an image that in a kind of in a spectacular fashion. But then in other moments, actually, this is thinking about you guys, is a really random, bizarre Roman snow day that we had early on that kind of certainly bubbled some of the plastic in ways that we didn't expect. But either way, it was certainly beautiful to kind of fall into it. But we really like this notion of how from certain moments this kind of comes to be, and then other points it just kind of deactivates and falls into the background and decouples in very strange kind of elongated fashions that kind of change the syncopation of how one moves throughout the space and also how one views it.
Do you want to open? I don't know.
You can go.
Okay. So the next project we're going to talk about is one that's actually almost completed. This is the Italian American Museum in New York. And I think just important to understand in terms of the next slide is one of the big components of this is just sort of in these areas around these major cities, right? Like Little Italy, Little Chinatown, like, there's a lot of sort of cultural memory that is tied to particular institutions and tied to architecture that is incredibly important when entering these spaces. So the Italian American Museum had been on this corner of Grand and Mulberry for quite a long time, a number of years. And they sold the building to a developer, obviously to maximize on the FAR, but promised a new home to the Italian American Museum in the new footprint of the building. So they went from a 2-story occupied space to essentially a 3-story space with more underground and a very sort of generous store frontage. But so within that, the sort of key component in sort of unifying these layers to each other was the triple-heighted space atrium to make the connection both visually via the exhibition spaces and the galleries, but also via the circulation so that visitors would be able to sort of see and understand how to move through the gallery as a really sort of critical component that how we kind of address this space.
So as in addition to that vertical quality, the question was how could we bring these ideas of flatness back in that were going to be inserted? And specifically, one of the questions became how do we relate them to that historic corner, which was the site, kind of the central axis of the immigration of the Italians in New York around that historic point that they are now moving away from. One of the questions for us became other kind of points of how could we think about this as a public give back to the community? And we were really interested in this notion of the Excedra as a space that is given back. Actually, what's interesting about Bramante's Excedra in the Vatican is that it's actually a false front that that corrects for the geometry or the separation between the main building and the kind of rear axis. So there is already an image-based kind of orientation project that's being invested there. And another architect that we were looking at a lot of the time was Victor Gruen, who would be using this distillation of scale of form to kind of create, shall we say, a setback for gathering around artifacts, or gathering in this case around commerce, but then using the oversized monumental entry point as a point of gathering attention. So in our early studies, we were always kind of diagramming back to that historic corner, or as a way to figurally kind of create an entry point that is both set in and kind of respectful of that axis that unfortunately the museum had to be displaced from. So in these early studies, we started to think about ways that folding could become a way to activate that kind of story of the large picture window. So for us, this became a question of both contextually aligning and perhaps playfully misaligning, where we started to take up the kind of larger developers kind of window point, started to enter into a figural window, which was then rotated in relationship to that historic axis that actually created that really hyper public setback that the museum was offering back to the city. This kind of depth was created through a level of paneling and kind of lining that would happen within that setback. And then the reinsertion of like a figural window within the overall figure was something we were interested in. The challenges of this became the questions of geometry. So we started to use the cone as a mechanism to unroll and think about how this could be fabricated in a very economic fashion. So you start to see here this kind of this geometry in terms of how it was splayed out and for kind of fabrication purposes. Most of this was done off-site, but you can see some of these guys that have come together on-site in terms of their kind of rear kind of ribs that were kind of in order to hold its form. We used an embroidered perforation that somewhat distills as one goes up, because once it opens the upper windows, there is a hidden upper window behind it. So we're seeing the cone here from below, the kind of, again, that cone which pulls the figure back into its alignment with the overall windows of the building. The question, what we were able to achieve was this expansion of the facade beyond its actual modest entry point. So you can start to see we're using questions about how to hide other egress points within the facade, as well as how do we still, even though we couldn't quite get DOT to give us the kind of permission to do the sidewalk, how can we still wrap that figure within inside of the figure? As Jen mentioned, the project is continuing on the interior, where the cone is also present in an atrium, coming up to a highly figural skylight, where actually, very funnily enough, this had to be created by contractors with specific chords, not dissimilar to how Pozzo worked in, for example, San Ignacio. And you can start to see the kind of geometry play out. The atrium is on your left in this image, at the bottom of the atrium on the right, and this kind of double height entry space that is coming into picture right now.
Okay, so another project that we did recently is New Agranon, which sort of is a commentary on urban agriculture. Particularly, the conversations around when you think about rooftop farming, especially in dense areas like New York, you have the sort of classic idea of the image on the left, where there's some cute hipster with a fun hat standing on a roof, ripping bell peppers off of a plant. But the reality is that the yields on those are intensive green roofs on existing buildings and do not necessarily provide as much structural support as one would need to create significant amounts of produce, is what's happening on the right. This is one of the largest interior vertical farms in the world. This is owned by Elon Musk's older brother. It's in New Jersey, so this moves into the shed typology. And this is the reality, I think, of agriculture into the future, right? This is a controlled environment. They're not worried about pests. They're not worried about weather events. They're going to have their microgreens and their kale, and production is just going to keep going.
And interestingly, although obviously Newark is a part of the city or the metropolis, it's still not in the classic kind of in our backyard of Manhattan kind of problem. So it's still a question of offsiting that which we need versus that which we want.
Similarly, at the same time that we were doing this project, there was an article that came out about the super tall. Shop is constructing there's a lot of pencil towers that are happening on Billionaires Row. And the existing kind of precedent that everyone was kind of pointing to at the time is the Vignoli Tower pictured here. So we were interested again in this sort of idea of, what are the specifics of this tower? Who lives here? Most of it obviously are investment properties. People don't actually live here. So there's a lot of controversy around these things. So we started to create this story for ourselves that Adam and Eve were bought, in the Vignoli Tower, and they're complaining about their Grubhub order being late, their trash chute is clogged, the elevator's down, and so they want to educate themselves more on, what are the issues around agriculture, and why are my buildings not working the ways that they should, and why am I dealing with all these issues in my billion-dollar apartment complex? So we looked at the tower specifically, and it houses roughly around 500 people. We were looking at the square area and starting to then push into the question of, if we were to visually map all of the land that it would take to support 500 people, what would that look like at the base of this pencil tower?
So starting in the kind of very small scale, we started to examine the idea that a person for a perennial cycle would require about 1/2 of an acre of agricultural yield, which of course, when you think about the 500 kind of person tower, it starts to resemble a fairly large substantial part of Central Park. Or what we started to fondly talk about is an agricultural AR, and instead of floor AR. So that would also just, starting to play with fun of kind of calibrated numbering systems would mean that there would be 10 more towers to feed this individual tower, or perhaps the kind of the super tall as a kind of super pencil strategy as a way to think about that kind of extension of land upwards. So, and maybe going the opposite direction, perhaps a different way to think about it is if this tower were to begin to hold all of its own agriculture, it would actually break it down to what we might think about as the commune, about 28 people living in this tower. So perhaps the kind of speculative history of the tower as we think about Rem Koolhaas and OMA is the notion of the worlds of worlds, each floor being its own world that could be very different. Well, maybe that could be each floor being its own agriculture. That would be very different. It was something that we started to imagine.
So we went back to the 1960s, which is when this little food pyramid on the left came into our being and understanding of what it means to create a balanced diet and be a healthy, happy human. And we essentially turned that into a projection of a diagram of how then that would work onto the tower. So what percentage of this tower would need to be grain, what would need to be fruit, dairy, meat, etc. And then just to be, I think, more global in our understanding of, North America's diet as opposed to other continents' diet, how would these towers, if they were to be replicated, be redistributed based on the needs around the world? And which it was very interesting in looking, I think, at Asia had a very small meat population. I think Oceania. Yeah, I was really blown away by the redistribution of the proportions of these things around the world. So Eve, back in her happy little foodless, trash chute-less apartment, begins to dream of what this new tower would look like, which then came New Agrenon. So in each of these sort of subsections of the tower, we again looked at the food pyramid. So there's looking at the grain field, wrapping its way around the base. The next would be the sort of fruit orchard, which bringing back the sort of espalier to maximize yield and accessibility would take place in the second sort of section. The third is the unraveling of the dairy field and having the cows roam free. The fourth, is the wheat window washer units. So similar to the New Jersey grain interior or lettuce interior, these would be stacked on top of each other and accessed through window washing sort of like units. Then the next one was the lettuce, looking at sort of hydroponic systems wrapping around for maximum capability. Then there was fish, so creating an interior sort of aquaponic system for that additional sort of meat. Then I think as sugar, I just went ahead and did a date farm. So we did date palm trees, which again, even this height would just be insane, but we're in the car now, we're going. And then the last, the very top, not the very top, the last section was the mushroom cave. So having a completely closed interior mushroom section. And then the very top would be a water filtration plant, which we calculated generally how much water this entire tower would need to complete the system.
So in many ways, all of these projects were kind of paired obviously against the kind of the foil tower on the left there. And they also kind of take in the genealogy of other superstructural projects throughout time. So obviously Foster's HSBC Bank on the kind of opening of the floor versus the kind of the hanging of a Guggenheim is kind of embedded versus other ideas such as the Sears Tower and the bundling of tubes became a question of how do we bring hydroponics versus the kind of Johnson wax kind of pullback of the facade becomes a vice of looking at a precedent and thinking about how it could be used in a kind of different form here.
So we also just created some interior images, really kind of just discussing the dichotomy of the two towers. The one on the left, obviously, being the Vignoli Tower of the high polished granite concrete, and the one on the right, being the work of the 28 workers and occupiers of this building, and sort of, the differentiation in sort of livable domestic space and their lifestyles.
So maybe as just like the way to kind of bring this home, I think we did bring this agricultural discussion forward into a different kind of form, because if not, the other question about our urban surfaces is how does this become a part of our vertical kind of everyday life? And really, how do we think about the idea of the way we build our facades as another form of bringing back the non-human into our larger ecologies? And for us, this was a time when we were looking at bricks and other kind of volumetric constructions, which of course, it's hard to talk about without pointing back to this guy, who we love. You can't not like LK, but at the same time, one of the things is that there's a certain level of shall we say, cynicism that we have to take about this role from a different point of view. One, we can think about it against that which is fired and the embodied energy. That's one way we've been tackling this point lately. But another one, just very clearly here, is maybe a more appropriate quote when you look at this in New York, is that this idea of, is it the idea of the image of brick that's being used versus the actual idea of the volumetrics of brick and its stacking? And perhaps there's a way that we should be thinking about both at the same time, even though, or maybe we should be indicting this practice of the image of brick as a gentrification practice of developers rather than actual a volumetric solid practice. I mean, so that would be most evident, for example, on the left, which we see all the time, is this notion of the sticker brick as something that is kind of laminated back onto the facade for the purposes of economics.
And in landscape, this is a conversation that I feel like I hear from everybody, like, oh, just let's put some plants on it. Let's make a green wall. These are highly unsustainable systems. They are full of plastic and pests and mold, and they need someone to baby them 24/7. And yes, I would love to quit my job and babysit a green wall. That would be delightful. 100%. But we're not there yet, I think is the point. And it seems like commonplace, but it is not. And similar to Jonathan's sort of comment about the gentrification of it, it is a conversation that needs to be happening as climate change is continuing to show us what it's capable of, that cities really need to be reconsidering facades as places in which microclimates could start to inhabit and sort of, bring down I'm totally blanking on the term, heat island effect. It's on the slide. The heat island effect, excuse me.
And, or just thinking about the lowering of the albedo. And that obviously there are some benefits to brick and clay from that, just in the sense that for the most part in relationship to other systems, for example, the ones in the laminated postmodern construction that we were jokingly indicting, has a much lower embodied energy. Simultaneously, as I know you guys are aware of in this school, there is a renaissance of other methods of using clay for other technologies in vis-a-vis deposition and paste-based extrusion.
And so the thing that we were kind of interested in with the capabilities of the robot is obviously then looking at the porosity that the brick could then be redefined with. So we started looking at some examples by Emerging Objects and Jenny Sabin with her polybrick. And then we started doing research on aeroponics, which is basically soil-based planting. It's ultimately not, soil is an excellent stabilizer, but it doesn't necessarily, and it carries nutrients and water and does many different things for plants, but it's not necessarily something that the plant needs in order to survive in the correct context. So in looking at the research as well, there is a lot of sort of curiosity about printing shells and material for plants to survive in. This traditionally has been done mostly with PLA, which unfortunately is not the most sustainable of materials. So
question was, could this become a way of thinking about procedurally driven porosities that would be something that would be correlated to, for example, a plant architecture versus perhaps an ornamental approach? So thinking about different typologies based on different root structures, perhaps this could be a way to think about almost an encoding of the facade for the types of kind of growth patterns that would exist inside of it. We started to think about how this could be done in different ways in terms of different technologies, and started to kind of think about, as a pilot project, the question of a non-axial or a multi-axial way of printing for the purposes of creating something that would be more akin to an architecture, even in the root form of a column, as we can see here in these early studies for an exhibition on Governor's Island, where we were starting to work out some of the early kinks back in like 2019 of the kind of the printing, starting again with large base robotic plastic extrusion. And then suddenly we started to get much more attention on this and kind of commissioned to kind of put this into play in specific contexts.
So, in looking at, again, the sort of non-axial printing, we then started thinking through, obviously, the construction of it, but also the sort of timeline of it. So we started thinking about the almost setting up like a nursery of letting the plants sort of establish themselves, giving them because there are essentially planting seasons. You should plant in the fall, and you should plant in the spring. You should not plant in the summer or the winter, duh. But it's important for a plant sort of life as well as sort of establishment periods. We were interested in that and hopeful that that would be the case.
And it also questions the notion of, if this was true, if we were thinking about a vegetative facade, should that mean that construction should alter towards that ecological idea that, for example, that Jen just brought in, a temporal change to construction as opposed to a pasting of a system onto another one. So, I don't know, here you can see some of the studies on, for example, the difference between a normal based extrusion process through a robotic arm versus a kind of a flat based some of the early studies that we were kind of putting together on existing foam pieces and how we could start to build these offsite in a way that they can be brought back into play in a much more economic, quick-based fashion.
And then, of course, just thinking through the realities of it, being in a public place, it needed a footing, it needed to be excavated, and there needed to be drainage and irrigation. So obviously just sort of the mechanics of making sure that this thing was safe and successful. So we started developing those, and then we got growing. The components started to come together, and then we started to attach the rings to each other. I was running some exhibits at home just to sort of see what was working in different sort of solar conditions and obviously with different irrigation schedules. And then it was time. We went and used a sonotube to allow for the drainage and the tieback of the irrigation that would be on a sort of constant mist cycle. And then once everything was sort of put together, we did have to put the plants in after. So I decided to go with a sedum, which is a succulent type that tends to have a lot more moisture in its leaves. So I knew it wasn't going to be as reliant on pulling moisture from sort of root-based systems. So I was hopeful that the establishment period would be much shorter.
And this is actually a project that is built in a town, which we'll talk a little bit about in this last final project, which has become a fortunate commission for us because they commissioned us for this because this is a town that was historically related to brick making and thinking about the question of what new types of bricks would be out in the world. In this kind of example, which was done in this level of an urban topiary here. And now we're trying to question how this could grow up into a much larger architecture at that same site where we were fortunate to gain the commission for a much larger museum. So this museum that we're working with now is the Haverstraw Brick Museum. When this site of Haverstraw is in the Hudson Valley, and this is where the majority of the bricks for the turn of the 20th century were produced and extracted. Actually, if you go to the museum, they're very eager to talk about how this crescent site was the site of a landslide due to over extraction of earth for the over extraction of clay for the purposes of the brickyards, which were set on this space. And the brick museum is right here. So it's really, this place is a history of extraction even today. That now fly ash is part of the pieces, part of what's being done south here. Again, that's the image of the landslide. And even today, because of the fact that this shoreline was had the history, you can see that the Hudson still expels these kind of older frog bricks out of the water line on a daily cycle. So we began working with the exhibition through a series of studios I was running on 3D printing clay, and we started to do a couple of kind of questions on how that could be space for non-human. But when we won this commission this is the existing building, to bring it forward, we started to question, are there other ways that we can tie into history to tell the story going forward?
And so we started looking at brick manufacturing yards architecturally and urbanistically. And one of the interesting sort of components of it was the smoke tower, right? So because it takes a lot of heat and energy to make bricks, which is why we don't do it as much today. But that, geometrically and also via pattern, there's a lot of sort of interesting differentiations that exist in these precedents. And then looking at the town, this is a very sort of ornate downtown that has a lot of rich sort of architectural history, a lot of bay windows and a lot of ornament decorated throughout of it. And there is something they're very proud of.
So this question of tambour, the repetitive use of the drums, was something we started to think about as something that was embedded in the DNA, both in terms of our own kind of project for them earlier, but also something that was kind of part of that history line. So here, this question of could that be a way of hiding, shall we say, a bay window, but also thinking about a space to be planting within in a much larger system. So there's kind of perhaps two ways that ecology could be worked back inside. We've been working with a strategy and a series of manufacturers on the question of reworking a type of Flemish bond that could be a way that could insert a 3D printed piece as a way to deal with the curvature that we're proposing that most bond systems don't want to deal with. And when you get into curvature, a lot of times you're dealing with custom bricks and or flattened bricks. So the question is, could the brick still be used as an envelope system with the help of our friend, the 3D printer? So we kind of think about it as like a Flemish flag that is starting to kind of wrap around the facade and kind of give it a different character. Here with certain setbacks that are dealing with localized kind of urban problems and also grandfather kind of lots around it, and spaces where we could insert the planting back in as a testing zone versus kind of larger scale And this is all really very fresh and kind of in the works right now. So we're still in schematic design on the project, but some of the early views that we've been playing with is the notion of a two-sided quality for this museum and its kind of fabric site. Here we're seeing some of those galleries that we're kind of proposing behind that veil of brick on the right, and then perhaps even in the back, the idea that the drums themselves take on a different notion of poche and use in kind of in their interior library. So that's what we have for you guys today.
That's it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, both of you. That was absolutely delightful. I'll be moderating the Q&A, and I definitely want to open it up to questions. If there are, we'll step in. I'm realizing right now I might have had a slight oversight. I don't know if we have people monitoring mics on either columns. If I could grab some volunteers to run mics on either side, that'd be great. But I will open it up to the floor if there's any questions about the work to start off. Otherwise, I'll jump in. All right, I'll fill the void for the first one. I think reflecting on the presentation and your kind of identities is really nice. For me, the idea of almost interfaces kept on coming up about how the practice itself operates as an interface, and how that it's reflected in the work as well too. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about maybe the ideas of tools as well too, and how tools, and we'll make that broad, whether it be technologies and or I think representation that you touched on as well too, how your firm, I guess, leverages tools both as a way to produce the work of these kind of interfaces you're designing, and also how they also possibly serve as interfaces between your respective disciplines and outside disciplines as well too.
I think with the cricket, I don't know.
No, good.
I mean, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like sometimes we're still students, or that we're always still testing, right? Or we're like asking questions of each other that neither of us really have an answer to. And so then it ends up being a trip to Michael's, where then I find a weird like printer thing for like moms to make cards for that then we buy 5 of. So I don't know. It's like tools are, I mean, especially as designers, I feel like we have to be creative about the tools that we use, right? And it doesn't matter what it's for, as long as we have a vision for what we want to do with it. That's what makes it kind of so fun. So I feel like that's like physical tools, but also, yeah, drawing. We're constantly sending stuff back and forth to each other and trying new things because we're never satisfied. But tools are really important to the process for sure.
Yeah, I think just thinking about, you said something about being kind of super students in a way, but I think there is a commitment to there are 2 types of commitments that I think is going on. There's a commitment to tooling, or the notion of investigating what do these specific tools, whether it's anamorphosis, to use your kind of representation technique as a tool, as you mentioned, versus the kind of cricket that Jen is mentioning, versus a parametric tool, committing to what does it do, what does it produce, what does it give us. But then there's also this other external matter of like reference material, for example, that a client might want to understand, or kind of a specific vantage point, for example, and how does that provide a different feedback? So there's, or even just like, and you mentioned the interface, like, I'm sure there's been a number of times where I've been like, hey, Jen, check out what Cinema 4D can do. And Jen's like, I don't care, that's stupid.
Yeah.
All right, let's try it again, just tweak it in a different way. So that kind of back and forth interface of the tooling, investigating it for itself, and then investigating amongst feedback is something that we're really committed to.
Questions?
Yeah, I think for me, if anything, it's about committing to either what is being asked versus what the medium you're working in has as an opportunity.
I can get it going. I guess part 2 to that. I think, maybe it's from my own perspective too, but I found the work really engaging because it crosses, you're wearing multiple hats as an academic, as a practitioner, as an architect, as a landscape architect as well too. And I think thinking about the feedback between those 2, actually they're kind of like 2 axes, right, of your disciplines and also your roles as academics and designers, I think is really compelling, and shows in the work and the richness of it. I was wondering, as an academic, right, I think there's a growing kind of movement towards, with at least speaking with the field of architecture, to do something like architecture plus, right? Like the discipline is need to be engaging other things, both in terms of finding itself, but also as a way to empower itself moving forward. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I think your practice sets itself up so well because it is necessarily interdisciplinary. And how does your research have been informing the practice, and vice versa as practice research?
I'm currently teaching what we at Pratt consider a thesis, or it's close to a thesis. It's a degree project, and it's very neatly split into the research semester and the design semester. And in general, there is a separation in the sense that when one's designing, I think I remember specifically one of my people I work for, in a very high-pitched nasally voice, said to me once, well, you just got to design it. You just got to design it. You just got to commit. Like the research was one thing, but now you just got to commit and design. And there is some truth to that. There is some kind of examine, but at the same time, I think that is a skill that we need to commit. And there is an adeptness that as one's moving through core education, one is building the kind of facility to do that as a reflex. But at the same time, we need to ask design big questions. We need to ask design out. We need to look outside and examine how it can touch new things. And that is where the research is. So for us, it is a matter of, I think we're looking, that is a way where we're building connections to new people, new people who perhaps were outside, and like how can that be tasked with the skill and acumen we've developed for new products.
I don't know, the part of the question that I think I'm really tied to is like the super architect, right? Or the super, like, how do you do everything? And there was a really great interview that Micah Van Bockenberg was asked about Brooklyn Bridge Park, where he was commenting on that if Central Park was built today, there's no way that Frederick Law Olmsted could have gotten away with like as little program as the park is, because like Brooklyn Bridge Park, he was just like hammered with, we want basketball courts, we want this, it's like programming now as a society is something that clients expect, or they just expect more, and everything has to perform in ways like, even the last, I remember developer project I worked on, she was like, well, I want the landscape to have a fire pit, a camping ground, and a dog wash. And I was like, all in the same like 800 square feet. So it's, I don't know. So I think as students and as, as designers, right, it is that kind of like, we have to exercise our agency and we have to be able to sort of say when enough is enough. But I think it's something that's also evolving a lot as we continue to evolve. And obviously social media contributes a lot of that, of us seeing what other places and people have. So it's hard. It's a hard like thing to like evolve with, but it's kind of expected of us.
Well, maybe another way to put it though is research in some ways is a form of agency. So I think one of the questions that we ask in school, particularly towards the end, is what is it that you want to do with the skills that you've learned, right? As opposed, like in the end, the client is going to give you lunacy of things that they want, and design is largely about problem solving. How do those things fit in the box? Even if we think back to the idea of Disegno, to some extent, it was co-opted by engineering as a practice that it broke it away from architecture. So in some ways, the architect needs to maintain a separation and as an agent that is could be thinking about new avenues for research, but it could also be thinking about new form, new kind of visual problems. That is, I think, that is where you have all of your voice.
Thanks. Can you talk to us a little bit about your collaboration? It was interdisciplinary, of course, we got that idea, but I'm really curious about the collaborative process between you guys when it's chilling out the idea. And I would like for our students to have a little bit more insight how that is. Many of us do collaborative projects, and then sometimes, oh, well, my idea. Where does and how does this come about? And thank you for your very interesting presentation.
Group work is hard. You experience it, we experience it. I don't know, what do you?
I think that's a truism. I was just on the phone with one of my students the other day on Zoom talking about it. I think another thing about it is fun that's happening. I think, and maybe use a kind of the word added value before, I think it becomes a check against that personal identity. So where it is entangling and growing together as opposed, and if it's growing, I think for us, a lot of times the work we look back on is the work where we know it grew together. We know it kind of learned from both of us as opposed to it becoming individual.
There was this great New Yorker piece right before Robert Venturi died on Mr. and Mrs. Architect, where they interviewed all of the couple. And Weissman Brady had this great quote that I love where Marion was like, "It's not done until we're both happy," which may mean we're at opposite ends of the office for half the day, but like until we're both happy, it doesn't go anywhere. But I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Until I'm like, okay, and you're like, yes, that's when it finally like moves on. But there's a lot of time where we're talking about it, we're bringing other things in, and we're informed. I mean, yeah, I know it's like I can go to an architecture review now after being married to him for a long time, and I know exactly what I'm talking about because I did all these tours.
But I also think there's another component about it, which is not just the work itself, but the transduction of the work. Transduction becoming like when animals work together and all of a sudden traits start to get passed around. So this kind of, I think, for example, like right now you're working on a book of elements of landscape, which was very much born of this conversation around, for example, lens examination of the elements of architecture in a way. So I think us having that conversation relative to a specific discipline, then it embarks. I mean, we could also say that was very much how the field condition was born as passing between corner back to stand out, for example. So I think that kind of that matriculation of an idea outside of where it began is, I think, always the promise. Well, and it happens naturally because we're at different universities. So in some ways we come together on projects and then we naturally go back and just kind of like migrate in different pools.
Yeah, I wanted to compliment, it came across very well balanced. And the way you had actually the interaction in the conversation and the graphics, it really came across very just well, these processes behind.
I mean, I thought that because first time we presented the work together, it was, I think we become more used to how that kind of goes, but it's, and perhaps with more discomfort with, I think actually the discomfort is also exciting.
Yeah, I think also you had some things to resolve, so you didn't come to the point you are now, but I think it's important for our students to know. Well, there maybe was a friction here and there, but I think in the end, what you present, I felt like it was really convincing how it came such together as a team of two different or overlapping disciplines because they were not as different as we think. At least that's how I look at it.
Well, the other thing I kind of say is when you're doing, I think it's good to be in a position of when you're uncomfortable with what you're doing, it means you're on the way to something. Because you're learning something new, you're kind of pushing beyond. So I think as a result of that, we do destabilize each other frequently in a way that forces us to kind of reacclimate and understand.
It's always nice to feel like you're done.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh wait, I'm not done.
Can't hear you online.
Thank you. Fantastic. And there's so much to chew on in the presentation and I think also in this conversation. So just generally, thanks for being here. I'm interested in this question, and I think this idea of collaboration, and it's aided because you all are connected in many levels. But I'm drawn to the inversion from early in the lecture of the image object flip of so taking something out of landscape architecture into architecture and vice versa. And for me, this gets a little bit back to Nate's question. I think there's some disciplinary systemic things you're doing that are crossing wires that are enabling this really fertile collaboration and distinct voices. I mean, it's more like an opera or an orchestra where the registers are like the trumpet stays the trumpet and the clarinet stays the clarinet, but they're learning from each other in a way. And so I'm excited about the systemic thinking, and because I think architects are amazing at only talking to architects and not being able to hear anybody else. And I don't want to say that about landscape architects, but I think that hyper specialization has been a disservice to. I mean, it's taken us to incredible things in medicine. But in terms of we've played that out culturally, I think we continue to lose relevance as a discipline. And so to me, there's hope in your work in this systemic cross up. And that's less a question and more an observation, but keep doing that, please.
I mean, I think the only thing I would say is it's tricky because on the one hand, what we know and we practice does give us authority in terms of our disciplinary understanding of a wall and its poche and how we kind of examine that from an interior organizational standpoint. And that, but those ideas have even more value than I think we give them credence in their the places where they are practiced historically. So I think if anything, it could be a doubling down in what we believe in and just examining like what is its portability.
That it's a doubling down our focus, but then connecting outward to, yeah.
Hi. So I thought the various typologies in your practice are very inspiring. So I know I won't be pigeonholed. I can really do whatever I want to do. My studio specifically is working with ceramic 3D printing. So I was wondering if you could talk about some challenges that you faced or what you found successful.
It's so messy.
Yeah, finding good wet space is critical. It doesn't piss anyone else off. I know we've been talking about this a lot lately, and in a way, and maybe this is a little overly romanticizing clay, but there is some nature of it that is really creates a level of humility in the sense that it doesn't conform to, shall we say, the parametric logics that we birthed in the digital era. So it kind of actually is oppositionary to that notion. I think in some ways that is certainly a level of feedback that maybe even suggests we can't preconceive of all of the connections we're making in architecture. We need to leave that open to facilitate other and broker other possibilities, just in the same way that as it droops, what is the consequences of its drooping in a way? That's not something I predicted, but now I can absorb that droop into the design. So I think I'm suggesting with clay and printing specifically, I think there's a lot of potential in letting it do what it wants to do, and then figuring out how to work that, figuring out what those opportunities come out of that process.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm really amazed. It's very coherent. I can't help to think about how your project is dealing with the concurrent image culture. A lot of them are extremely striking graphically at the same time as well. So I can't help thinking about representation in your case is not only about delivering a message, try to communicate, but rather than there's more information beyond that, which is facilitate the design at the same time. I wonder whether you can speak to how, a graphic or representation can, help you to develop certain ideas and along your practice.
We did this exhibition at Pratt I curated a couple of years ago called In the Round on the Flat. And I think one of the things that has been fascinating to us is how things are consumed as much as how they are experienced. And I think different generations deal with this in different ways, and contemporarily, how a building is perceived on Instagram is in many ways more powerful, but as powerful as how it's experienced in the physical realm. So that flattening is hyper real. And the question could be, can that be subverted? Is there a slowing of architecture or a defamiliarization of the image that can happen, to use the Shklovsky term, so that there's the unexpected, or it suggests that the activation of real space still has promise? Or is it about the subversion of the image? These are things that we're talking about a lot. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Better answer than I do.
Oh, thank you very much for the great presentation. I'm really fascinated by especially the kind of utopian infrastructure, the Aglanon. I will form a question later. I'm still thinking about it. um, I'm just again coming back to the early when you were introducing your practice, the idea of inversion of the idea of image, architecture as image and landscape as object. So I guess this is kind of like a still preliminary stage of a question, or more like a commentary. I'm thinking about the theory of the architecture, right? The theory of architecture come from the idea of the theory as a vision, as the architecture as vision, and the theoria, the Greek meaning idea of to see. And also you talk about the perspective and how the perspective from the idea of divine order, the idea of kind of mimesis of nature, mimesis of order, of divine and into geometry, and this, all the idea of the image. Um, and I my observation is that a lot of the image in your project, they're sort of intentional image, right? They're a still image, or they're engaged in a moment of temporality. Um, I was wondering if in your process or in the idea of the image, at what point does the image become embodied image? And at what point the image become unintentional or become disruptive? That become unintentional, where the observers start to reinterpret the image and start to reorganize their own experience, where the image becomes sequential and instead of still, right? So I'm just wondering that conversation, or it's not really a question, kind of ongoing, kind of want to talk about it.
I mean, I think it kind of like it, and just thinking early on, like so much of the conversation, because John was really interested in anamorphosis, became about the station point, which I think then personally, then I started doing a lot of station point historical research. So it led me to Le Notre and Versailles and Chantilly and all of these like massive villas that were being constructed, right? Which were all based on Henry VIII getting up, walking out of the balcony and seeing a new garden every single day, right? And being so impressed with how much property he had and like how great he was. And so I don't know, there was, and within that, I think it really also started to kind of, in the reverse way, made me start to think about control, right? Controlling the state vantage point, controlling the geometry, controlling the proportions, the materiality, the reflectivity, thinking about it through landscape, through seasonality, right? And so when we started having these conversations, and he really was like, well, how do we design for these moments? It really just kind of, I think for me, then started to translate that sort of like landscape as object into it, right? Like thinking about objectively, what are the components that I'm drawing, and how is the design sort of flattening, to go back to the third thing, these decisions ultimately, and then how obviously that then sparks into culture, right? Because we're still visiting these places and standing on that balcony, obviously with a horde of 300 other people, but we're like yearning to experience the curated design in a way that I think goes back and forth between obviously the drawing to now the photo. And so testing design through those moments is still, even with the advancements of three-dimensionality and VR and all that kind of stuff, like I think the flatness is still a very relevant drawing to make.
David once said to me, Johnny, you're way too interested in the diagram. And I don't know if he meant this, but your comment made me think a lot about inserting intent into the actualization of the work, or the tracery of the process. So in some ways, the station point could be argued as a tracery, and that it becomes a mark that someone else can see how the machine kind of operated, right? And one question I've been thinking a lot about lately is how important is that to still be a part of the experience versus a part of the process? I mean, like, could those points be embedded into Poche in a way where they're unoccupiable and they're part of a And therefore, there is still an active human kind of insertion or geometric process in there, but it is not then humanly accessible. I think the question of how much is the trace important for others. I mean, the one thing I will say that as a reaction to the period in which I was educated in, was at that time, it was very much about geometry in a way where we were talking about the object without its experience. And perhaps this was a literalization of that experience through moments. Whether that still needs to, whether that could be a design process that's not experienced, I'm not sure. Something that I am thinking.
Thank you. We'll take one more question.
I guess I was sort of interested when you were talking about the program earlier and pushing back against that idea of program. I was interested how that applies to sort of the larger scale infrastructure projects, things like, you know, moving sewage or having crop yield, and where you sort of reconcile that pushing back against the program as a limiting factor versus sort of embracing, you know, the social factor of those things for the city. I thought that was really interesting.
I mean, the nice thing about some of these projects being more speculative is, right, is I'm making the rules or we're making the rules, right? It's like, okay, yeah, I don't have to answer. Nancy isn't going to call me and say, but what about my dog wash? But it's, you know, and as designers and I think or as students particularly, like you so much making decisions, and we're asking so much of you, and we're like, draw it again. And it's, you know, and yeah, and of course, and I always tell my students, like, you should challenge me. Like, yes, like, let's have these debates, and I'm going to tell you when it's ugly, and I'm going to tell you when it's still not enough, or what the, like, the hard rules are, because I want you to figure out your agency within that. So, you know, I think, again, kind of go back to, like, we're still students, and the fact that we're still learning, like, what are our limits and what are our parameters. Yeah, it's sometimes fun, like in competitions or in some of these, you know, to play or to push or to, like, well, what if, and imagine, because that's what we do, right? We're creative, and we're trying to develop creative ways to address some of these problems. But yeah, I mean, but ultimately, I don't want to be a planner. I don't want to be like, yes, I would love to see these things upgraded in an intelligent, like, thoughtful way. I would love to obviously, like, yeah, help politicians under, but that's also like, but I understand that web isn't also where I want to spend my time, like, having argument. I don't know, maybe as I get older, I'll get more crotchety and, like, I'll be like, we're gonna join the planning board. I'm not there yet. I still like playing in Fantasyland a little bit and just being speculative. But I mean, as we change, I think our position with that kind of stuff changes. But it's like, but you have to dream too. You can't just be like, oh, well, this is the way it is and it's fine. Like, what's the fun of that?
As sometimes the program or the client becomes, you can only bring the capital P personal project so far with one project, one small lowercase p project. And I think the question is, I think we become a little bit more critical on what other projects we add in so that we can facilitate a bigger idea. So I think with every kind of program, everything, we try to push things along a little bit further, but the goal is to keep drawing and keep asking new projects or looking for new projects to bring about our voice. So if anything, if that program gives you a challenge, keep drawing and come about it from a different angle.
Yes.
On that, I think we'll wrap things up. I want to thank Jen and John.
Thank you guys so much.